that more and more people show up when they, to include me, we all struggle to get any place on time. So even if it is COVID, we don't care. We still do things our own way.
That's exactly.
So let me, as always, monthly, I have to say I'm thankful for Brant for continuing to show up. And I really do mean what I say about people, our instructors making this commitment, COVID and post-COVID, pre-COVID, to continue to teach for us. And it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. So we're grateful to you, Brant, for showing up every month. And we're grateful for the variety of the programming that you bring us. And of course, this one is right on topic this month for Black History Month. But an interesting story, and what you said earlier does apply. It is a story that needs to be told. And you're a good one to kind of introduce us to that. So thank you, Brant, very much. And I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. It's nice to be with you again. And again, this story perhaps is maybe one of the most undertold stories. The story of Bass Reeves, perhaps the greatest lawman in American history. And when I say the greatest lawman, names we know like Kit Carson or Wyatt Earp pale in comparison to what this man did. And again, we're celebrating Black History Month, and this man has a storied life. He definitely is a game changer. He changed Oklahoma, definitely. And of course, the stories of game changers are strictly my opinion. And I think you all remember this song. I've told you who wrote it. I'm back in the saddle again, out where a friend is a friend, where the longhorn cattle feed on the lowly gypsum weed. Back in the saddle again, riding the range once more, toting my old 44, where you sleep out every night and the only law is right. Back in the saddle again, whoopee-tie-yi-yo, rocking to and fro. Back in the saddle again, whoopee-tie-yi-yay, I go my way. Back in the saddle again, I'm back in the saddle again, out where a friend is a friend, where the longhorn cattle feed on the lowly gypsum weed. Back in the saddle again. The greatest lawman in the Old West, the legend of Bass Reeves, the most feared deputy U.S. Marshal in the Indian country. He was the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi. He worked mostly in Arkansas and the Oklahoma Territory. During his long career, he was credited with arresting more than 3,000 felons. He shot and killed 14 outlaws in self-defense. When you consider, out of 3,000, he shot and killed only 14. It was a lot easier to kill a felon than it was to bring him back, because you had to bring him back hundreds of miles. It's hard to describe the chaotic environment of this period of time in the late 1800s and so on. Indian Territory, which is what Oklahoma was, and I'll show you a little better map. This is what it looked like. And what it did, they attempted to allocate portions of the state into various tribes. There were perhaps 30 tribes that were assigned particular areas there. And of course, at that time, Oklahoma was not a state. It was called Indian Territory. It's a little better idea of how the partitions work. If you looked at in the area where he was working, it was mostly in the Creek, Cherokee, and Osage area. But Choctaw, Chickasaw, Comanche, every tribe was there. Remember, this is in the late 1800s. Oklahoma was not a state until 1907. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838. He and his family were slaves owned by Arkansas State legislator William Steele Reeves. When Bass was 8, Reeves moved to Grayson County, Texas. So you can see he was moved to Texas, born in Arkansas, moved to Texas in the northern part. Because he was owned by a man named Reeves, Bass took the surname of his owner, like other slaves of the time. Working alongside his parents, he was a water boy until he was old enough to become a field hand. He was tall. At 6'2", he was a giant. The average man in those days was like 5'6". George Reeves, son of the owner, made Bass his companion. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Texas sided with the Confederacy, and George Reeves went into battle, taking Bass with him. During the Civil War, Bass parted company with Reeves, either because of mistreatment or because Bass beat up on George after a dispute in a card game. Anyway, Bass fled north into the Indian Territory. Living in the wilderness by himself, he was a fugitive slave. One day he saw an Indian girl being attacked by wolves. He killed the wolves and saved the girl, but was bitten and losing blood. He took her back to where he thought she came from and fell asleep. When he awoke, he had been rescued by the Indian family of the girl he saved. In the Oklahoma Territory, he lived with the Cherokee, Seminole, and Creek Indians, learning their languages, and he honed his firearm skills, becoming very quick and accurate with a pistol and a rifle. He was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and no longer a fugitive, Reeves left Indian Territory. He bought land near Van Buren, Arkansas, becoming a successful farmer and rancher. A year later, he married Nellie Jenny from Texas and immediately began to have a family, raising 10 children on their homestead, 5 girls and 5 boys. The family lived happily on the farm. However, his life as a contented farmer was about to change when Judge Isaac Parker was appointed judge for the Federal Western District Court, Fort Smith, Arkansas, on May 10, 1875. Indian Territory had become extremely lawless, as thieves, murderers, and anyone else wishing to hide from law took refuge in the territory that had no law. Before Oklahoma was a state, it was a territory. When the 5 civilized tribes, the Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Chickasaws, were forcibly removed from their ancestral home in the southeast, they were relocated to an area called the Indian Territory. Because the 5 tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, the federal government forced them to renegotiate their treaties and cede half the western half of Indian Territory for the settlement of other tribes. What could possibly go wrong? So you see how the territory was partitioned. And in addition, it was opened in 1890 to white settlers. And it was a free land grab. The Indian Territory boasted an unusual mix of peoples and cultures. It was the home of Indians, Indian freedmen, the black slaves of the Indians who were emancipated after the Civil War and made citizens of the 5 tribes, white settlers, African Americans, former slaves who now rented land from the Indians as sharecroppers, and outlaws fleeing the law and squatting on the land. This made the Indian Territory a highly desirable place for horse thieves, bootleggers, murderers, outlaws to hide out and lay low. At the time, it was estimated of the 22,000 whites living in Indian Territory, 17,000 were criminals. This was truly the Wild West, or as the saying went, quote, "No Sunday west of St. Louis, no God west of Fort Smith," unquote. The Indian Light Force Police and the tribal courts governed this diverse population, but the tribal courts only had jurisdiction over citizens of the 5 tribes. If a crime was committed by an Indian on another Indian, it was handled by these tribal courts. And they were an imposing group. That's Geronimo. Non-freedmen, blacks, whites, and Indians who committed a crime against a person who was not a citizen of the Indian nations had to be tried in the U.S. federal courts in Paris, Texas, and Fort Smith, Arkansas. So the only U.S. law enforcement officers in Indian Territory were the U.S. Marshals. Such were the conditions that prevailed when Judge Isaac Charles Parker presided at Fort Smith, Arkansas, as judge of the Federal Court of the Western District of Arkansas, with criminal jurisdiction over what is now Oklahoma. Judge Parker's court was without a model until May 1889. There was no appeal from Judge Parker's court in criminal cases. Even the Supreme Court of the United States did not have the power to review or overturn the findings of Judge Parker's court. One of Parker's first official acts was to appoint U.S. Marshal James F. Fagan as head of the some 200 deputies he was told to hire. Fagan heard of Bass Reeves' significant knowledge of the area as well as his ability to speak several tribal languages, and he was soon recruited as a U.S. deputy. The lawmen came with the sun, there was a job to be done, and so they sent for the badge and the gun of the lawman. And as he silently rode, where evil violently flowed, they knew he'd live or he'd die by the code of the lawman. A man who rides all alone, and all that he'll ever own is just a badge and a gun. He's known as the lawman. That was from a TV series in the 1950s. That's Bass Reeves' oath of office taken as a deputy marshal. He could not write, so he obviously had someone write his signature. The deputies were tasked with cleaning up the Indian Territory, and on Judge Parker's orders, bring him dead or alive. Reeves joined other lawmen that would also become legendary, such as Heck Thomas, Bud Ledbetter, and Bill Tillman, covering some 75,000 square miles. The U.S. court at Fort Smith was the largest in the nation. That's a later picture taken. Bass Reeves is in the front row there. First row, lower left. The U.S. Marshals, who rode for months at a time, looked for wanted criminals to arrest and bring back to Fort Smith or Paris, Texas. Depending on the outlaws for whom he was searching, a deputy would generally take with him a wagon, a cook, and a Native American guide. Often they made round trips of more than 800 miles. Reeves began to ride the Oklahoma Range in search of outlaws. Although he could not read or write, it did not curb his effectiveness. Before he headed out, he would have someone read him the warrants, and he would memorize them. When asked to produce the warrant, he never failed to pick out the correct one. That's Indian Territory, before the Panhandle. Former slave, invincible lawman. This is from that article. Roll over Wyatt Earp and tell Bat Masterson the news. Of all the men who wore a badge and wielded six-gun and rifle against the forces of lawlessness in the Old West, not one stood as tall in the saddle as Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. A burly black man who chased, apprehended, and gunned down black, red, brown, and white desperados in the Indian Territory from 1875 to 1907. Reeves was bigger in real life than Marshal Dillon was in fiction. Newspaper accounts of his exploits during those wild and rambunctious days frequently referred to as the Invincible Deputy, U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves. Indian Territory was the most dangerous place for a U.S. Marshal to work, then or ever. In the period before Oklahoma statehood, over 100 U.S. Marshals were killed in the line of duty. Let's put that number in perspective. Since the U.S. Marshal Service was created in 1789, more than 200 marshals have been killed in the line of duty. 120 of those, 60%, were killed in the Indian Territory before statehood in 1907. That's right. More than half of all the U.S. Marshals ever killed were killed in the Oklahoma Territory. 80 miles west of Fort Smith was known as the Deadline. and whenever a deputy marshal crossed the line, he took his own life in his hands, and he knew it. On nearly every trail would be found, posted by outlaws, a small card warning certain deputies if they ever crossed the deadline, they would be killed. Reeves had a dozen of these cards, which were posted for his special benefit. And in those days, such a notice was no idle boast, and many an outlaw has bitten the dust trying to ambush a deputy on these trails. An imposing figure, always riding on a large white stallion, Reeves began to earn a reputation for his courage and success at bringing in or killing many desperados of the territory. Always wearing a large hat, he was usually a spiffy dresser, with his boots polished to a gleaming shine. He was known for his politeness and courteous manner. However, when the purpose served him, he was a master of disguises and often utilized aliases, sometimes appearing as a cowboy, farmer, gunslinger, or outlaw. Himself, he always wore 2 Colt pistols, butt forward for fast draw. Ambidextrous, he rarely missed his mark. Leaving Fort Smith with a pocket full of warrants, Reeves would return months later, herding a number of outlaws charged with crimes ranging from bootlegging to murder. Paid in fees and rewards, he would make a handsome profit before spending time with his family and returning to the range once again. An old Johnny Cash song. A young cowboy named Billy Joe grew restless on the farm, a boy filled with wanderlust who really meant no harm. He changed his clothes and shined his boots and combed his dark hair down, and his mother cried as he walked out, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." He laughed and kissed his mom and said, "Your Billy Joe's a man. I can shoot as quick and straight as anybody can, but I wouldn't shoot without a cause. I'd gun nobody down." But she cried again as he rode away, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." He sang a song as he rode, his guns hung at his hips. He rode into a cattle town, a smile upon his lips. He stopped and walked into a bar and laid his money down, and he heard again his mother's words, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." He drank his first strong liquor, then to calm his shaking hand, and tried to tell himself that he had become a man. A dusty cowboy at his side began to laugh him down, and he heard again his mother's words, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." Filled with rage, then Billy Joe reached for his gun to draw, but the stranger drew his gun and fired before he even saw. As Billy Joe fell to the floor, the crowd all gathered round and wondered at his final words, "Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town." The tales of his captures are legendary, filled with intrigue, imagination, and courage. On one such occasion, Reeves was pursuing 2 outlaws in the Red River Valley near the Texas border. Gathering a posse, Reeves and other men set up camp some 28 miles from where the 2 were thought to be hiding at their mother's home. After studying the terrain and making a plan, he soon disguised himself as a tramp, hiding the tools of his trade, handcuffs, pistol, and badge under his clothes. Setting out on foot, he arrived at the house wearing an old pair of shoes, dirty clothes, carrying a cane, and wearing a floppy hat complete with 3 bullet holes. Upon arriving at the home, he told a tale to the woman who answered the door that his feet were aching after having been pursued by a posse who had put the 3 bullet holes in his hat. After asking for a bite to eat, she invited him in. She began to tell him of her 2 young outlaw sons, suggesting that the 3 of them should join forces. He claimed fatigue, and she consented to let him stay a little while longer. As the sun was setting, Reeves heard a sharp whistle coming from beyond the house. Shortly after, the woman went outside and responded with an answering whistle. 2 riders rode up to the house, talking at length with her outside. The 3 of them came inside, and she introduced her sons to Reeves. After discussing their various crimes, the trio agreed it would be a good idea to join up. Bunking down in the same room, Reeves watched the pair carefully as he went to sleep, and when they were snoring deeply, he handcuffed the pair without waking them. When early morning approached, he kicked the boys awake and marched them out the door. Followed for the first 3 miles by their mother, who cursed Reeves the entire time, he marched the pair the full 28 miles to the camp, where the posse men waited. The outlaws then were delivered to the authorities and a $5,000 reward collected. Do you know how much money that was in those days? That's an article from the Decatur, Illinois newspaper in 1884. One of the high points of Reeves' career was apprehending a notorious outlaw named Bob Dozier. Dozier was known as a jack of all trades when it came to committing crimes, as they covered a wide range from cattle and horse rustling to holding up bank stores and stagecoaches, to murder and land swindles. Because Dozier was hard to catch and many lawmen had tried and failed to apprehend him, Dozier eluded Reeves for several months. After refusing to surrender, Reeves killed Dozier in a gunfight, December 20th, 1878. Though the tales of Reeves' heroics are many and varied, the toughest manhunt for the lawman was that of his hunting down his own son. After having delivered 2 prisoners to U.S. Marshal Leo Bennett in Muskogee, Oklahoma, he arrived to bad news. His own son had been charged with the murder of his wife. Though the warrant had been lying on Bennett's desk for 2 days, the other deputies were reluctant to take it. Although Reeves was shaken, he demanded to accept the responsibility for finding his son. 2 weeks later, Reeves returned to Muskogee with his son and turned him over to Marshal Bennett. His son was tried and sent to Kansas Leavenworth prison. However, sometime later, with an exemplary prison record, his son was pardoned and lived the rest of his life as a model citizen. In 1907, law enforcement was assumed by state agency, and Reeves' duties as a deputy marshal came to an end. Next, Bass took a job as a patrolman with the Muskogee, Oklahoma Police Department. During the 2 years that he served, there were reportedly no crimes on his beat. He hired on with the police force in Muskogee. He was nearly 70 years old and walking with a cane, but he still put the fear of God into lawbreakers. During his 2 years in the force, not a single crime occurred in his patrol area. Welcome to Muskogee. Reeves' diagnosis with Bright's disease finally ended his career when he took to his sickbed in 1909. He died January 12, 1910, and although he was buried in Muskogee, Oklahoma, the exact location of his grave is unknown. That's the death notice. The statue in Fort Smith, Arkansas, is in honor of the great African-American deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, who is believed to be the first black U.S. deputy marshal west of the Mississippi. Over the 35 years that Bass Reeves served as a deputy U.S. Marshal, he earned his place in history by being one of the most effective lawmen in Indian Territory, bringing in more than 3,000 outlaws and helping to tame the lawless territory. This is the last cowboy song, the end of 100-year waltz. The voices sound sad as they're singing along, another piece of America's lost. He rides the feedlots, clerks in the markets, on weekends selling tobacco and beer. And his dreams of tomorrow surrounded by fences, but he'll dream tonight of when fences weren't here. He blazed the trail with Lewis and Clark, and eyeball to eyeball old Wyatt back down. Stood shoulder to shoulder with Travis in Texas, and rode with the 7th when Custer went down. Remington showed us how he looked on canvas. Louis L'Amour has told us his tale, and the highwayman They sing about it and wish to God they could have ridden his trail. The Old Chisholm Trail is covered in concrete. They truck it to market in 50-foot rigs. They roll by his markings and don't even notice, like living and dying was all he ever did. This is the last cowboy song, the end of a 100-year waltz. The voices sound sad as they're singing along another piece of America's lawn. This is the last cowboy song. This is the last cowboy song. Killing some 14 men during the service, Reeves always said that he never shot a man when it was not necessary for him to do so, in the discharge of his duty to save his own life. Remarkable life of Bass Reeves. That's a testimonial in Muskogee. And here's an interesting story. Toughest cowboy to ever live was a black man named Bass Reeves. Captured over 3,000 criminals. He is the man Hollywood patterned the Lone Ranger's story off of. 1 in 4 cowboys was black, despite the stories told in popular books and movies. In fact, it's believed that the real Lone Ranger was inspired by the African-American man named Bass Reeves. This is all anecdotal. There's no evidence of this, but it's believed that the reason they put a mask, a black mask on Lone Ranger, was to depict the actual blackness of Bass Reeves. The black cowboy is legendary in the West, from the Buffalo Soldiers on. Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the only one we got. And without it, we got nothing. Bass Reeves. In my own way, I'm a believer. In my own way, right or wrong. I don't talk too much about it. Something I keep working on. I don't have too much to build on. My faith has never been that strong. There is a man there in that building. He's a holy man, they say. He keeps talking about tomorrow while I keep struggling with today. He preaches hell, fire, and brimstone. Heaven seems so far away. I do believe in a higher power, one that loves us one and all, not someone to solve our problems nor to catch me when I fall. He gave all of us a mind to think with and to know what's right or wrong. He is that inner spirit that keeps us strong. In my own way I'm a believer, but not in voices I can't hear. I believe in a loving Father, one I never have to fear. That I should live life at its fullest, just as long as I am here. The end of the story of Bass Reeves. Let me stop screen sharing. And I'd love to hear any comments or questions or answers.
That was great. We've got a story for you.
Go ahead. Everybody unmute if you would.
Okay, go.
We're from Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and Bill Doolin was holed up in a basin bathhouse there.
Soaking in a tub.
No, you want to tell it? You want me to tell it?
You can tell it.
And Bill Tillman was sent to get him.
Oh, really?
Bill Tillman, yes. And He came to town, spent the night in the hotel across the street from it. Well, next morning, accosted Mr. Doolin in the lobby, got him down, handcuffed him, took him back to his room, packed his grip, took him back across the street to the hotel and had breakfast. And then he went down and caught the train. He telegraphed Guthrie that they had taken him in. Excuse me. And when they got on the train, he said, "Mr. Doolin, this is a newspaper account, I'm telling you." And he said, "Mr. Doolin, we've got a long ride ahead of us. Give me your word that you won't escape, and I will unhandcuff you." He gave his word, kept his word, and when they got to Guthrie, excuse me, word got out that they were coming, and there's a great crowd there to see him. They want to see this outlaw, Bill Doolin. And the newspaper account says, "Two unassuming gentlemen, neither in leg irons or handcuffs, exited the train, got into their conveyance, was on the way to the courthouse, and the crowd realized that was Bill Doolin, and they were greatly disappointed."
That's a great story. That's terrific.
We live in bandit territory. We love all these stories. And we've been to Muskogee, and we've been to that whole area. We've had Belle Starr. Belle Starr used to buy her hats in Eureka Springs.
Is that right?
And who are the boys? The outlaws, the brothers. The brothers.
What brothers?
Oh gosh, the brothers that I always say, "Where's the house?" Jesse James and his brother.
Oh, that's not, they were never there.
Yeah, well, he said they weren't. We know where a relative of theirs lived.
No, you know where Dr. Samuel had some kin folks in Clifty, Arkansas. They were not kin to Jesse James.
Yeah, they were kin to his wife. He married his wife, his mother. Anyway, then Samuel's name on the mailbox was there for a long time, up until about 4 years ago. I guess they got too much publicity and they changed it for the family move. But we've been through the graveyard and everything.
I had planned a trip to Muskogee this past spring, and unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I couldn't do it. But that's still on my bucket list. And of course,
Get my phone number for Eureka Springs for me, or from Victoria, before you go. I'll give you a tour.
yeah, I'd like that. I'd like that. But that's an important area, and it's interesting because there was a recent Supreme Court decision in Oklahoma, and the Supreme Court ruled on the fact that the Osage Indians own a large part of that territory.
Oh yeah, Osage were in our area.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting story. It hasn't played out yet because obviously there's huge investments in oil and land and so on. So
Right. But you know, they were planning on building a U.S. Marshals Museum.
Oh, really? Oh, no, I didn't know
They've been
that.
collecting money forever, and it'll be one of those things you can get in on your national pass.
Yeah.
They have a museum there now, but it's going to be a specific U.S. Marshals Museum. Also in Berryville, Arkansas, there's a gun museum, and I never went to it for years because I'm not into guns. They've traveled all over the world, and they donated all this stuff to the city. I think they charge $1 to get in.
No.
And there are things, there are relics like from Belle Starr and the
Yeah.
different outlaws, guns and things like that. I think they got her saddle in Fort Smith, Belle Starr saddle. And I'm still looking for a postcard if anyone goes to flea markets. Not labeled Belle Starr, but it's Belle Starr on a horse with this big fancy hat on, sitting in front of two little houses that are now where our, that's where her hat shop was. And I saw that postcard when I first moved there and never thought it would ever disappear. And nobody, even the collectors, nobody has them.
Well, I do believe that Belle Starr sold more than hats, and I won't offer any more comment other than that.
She was smart. She could play the piano and she was educated. She just got mixed up with the wrong crowd. We did a lot of research on her,
Yes.
and all her stories are different.
And
There's
interesting.
there's one account of her talking to in quotes, talking to a newspaper lady, saying that she rode off in the middle of the night and so held her hat and all that stuff. So-and-so married her. But when you look up her wedding license, it's totally different. So I figure she was so young, her father said, okay, now you got to have a real wedding.
Yeah.
That's what I figure happened because
Sense.
the photograph the guy was passing around and it depicts exactly what she stated. So he has it. Look up Belle Starr's wedding, find a photograph.
Let me mention one other thing while I think of it. For those of you who've been watching Yellowstone, which is an amazing story, it's a little rough, but it's a story. It stars Kevin Costner. He's active in the direction. But they released a prequel that is of Kevin Costner's family coming west. It's called 1883, and it's on Paramount Plus. But I will tell you, it is the best TV I have seen because it tells the story of the Western migration, exactly what it was like. So if you have the opportunity, it does, Paramount Plus does cost, I think, $5 a month extra. But just for that show alone, it is worth it. There have been about
So is that 1883 or Yellowstone?
18. Yellowstone is available on free TV. I think it's on Paramount. But 1883 is available on Paramount Plus, which is a premium streaming TV. And they're both well worth it. I will warn you, it's rough. It's really rough, language-wise, violence and stuff like that. But it's really, it's real. It's really real. So, and especially 1883 and the story of the westward migration and how it was done is pretty compelling.
Yeah. Blue Springs is 5 or 6 miles from my house, and the Indians camp there. That's one of their stopping points on the Trail of Tears.
That's a story. But,
Yeah.
Anybody else have any thoughts or comments or questions?
I thought it was great. What you gonna give us next?
I'm not sure. But I think that next month is Women's History Month. So I'm willing to bet you a quarter that I'm going to be doing something on women's history. So, anyway, well, thank you all for coming today. I look forward to seeing you, and you all stay safe, okay? See ya, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.